The distress call had been running for 6 days before anyone in the drift answered it. Nora Cade heard it on the 4th day, faint under the static, 3 notes repeating on a frequency nobody used anymore because the relay towers that once carried it had gone dark a decade ago. Most captains logged frequencies like that and forgot them within the hour. A 6-day-old signal on a dead channel usually meant a dead ship, and dead ships didn't pay, and Nora had a crew to feed and a hold half full of scrap that needed to make port before the season's buyers closed their books. She listened to it twice through her headset anyway, alone in the cockpit of the Sparrow, boots up on the console, a cup of station-brewed coffee gone cold in the holder beside her. Outside the viewport, the drift stretched in every direction, a slow, silent field of broken hulls and drifting cargo containers and the occasional dead satellite, lit faintly by a star too far away to warm anything. People who didn't work the drift for a living called it a graveyard. People who did called it a living, because that was exactly what it gave them, piece by scavenged piece, if you were patient and careful and willing to answer things nobody else would. On the 5th listen, she turned the ship toward it. She'd been running salvage out of the drift for 11 years, long enough that most of the reasons she'd started had worn away and left only the reason she stayed. Her father had flown cargo routes for a licensed carrier his whole working life, answering to a schedule and a company and, eventually, to a debt he'd taken on to keep the family solvent through a bad decade, a debt that had followed him quietly for the rest of his life, the kind that never showed up on any single bill but shaped every choice he made anyway. Nora had watched that shape him long before she understood what it was. When she'd finally saved enough to buy the Sparrow outright, second-hand and half-broken, the thing she'd wanted most wasn't the ship. It was the simple, uncomplicated fact of owing nothing to anyone she hadn't chosen to owe it to. She still felt that clean, sharp relief every time she signed a contract and knew, completely, that it ended exactly where she'd agreed it would end. Her engineer, a wiry man named Pip O'Say who had flown with her for 4 years and had an opinion about nearly everything, stuck his head through the cockpit hatch, wiping grease from one hand with a rag that had clearly given up being useful for that purpose some time ago. "Tell me that course correction wasn't for the dead channel signal," he said. "It was for the dead channel signal. Nora, we've got a hold full of scrap that needs to hit the Farron buyers before their books close for the cycle. We divert for this, we miss the window, and then we are sitting on unsellable cargo for another 6 weeks. I know. It's not a paying signal. It's a nobody's coming signal. Those are different categories of problem, and only one of them is our problem." Nora didn't look away from the viewport, where shape was starting to resolve out of the dark, angular, tumbling slow, one thin strip of amber light running along its spine like the last coal in a dying fire. "Somebody kept that beacon running for 6 days, she said. "That's not wreckage behaving like wreckage. That's a choice somebody made, over and over, every hour it took to keep it going. I want to know why." Pip looked at her for a long moment, in the particular way he had of already knowing he'd lost an argument and simply wanting the record to reflect that he'd tried. "You're going to answer it because nobody else will," he said. "That's not a business model, Captain." "No," Nora agreed, and there was something almost like a smile in it. "It really isn't." The wreck resolved fully 40 minutes later, a mid-range freighter, maybe 30 years old by the hull styling, its running lights dark except for that single amber thread of life support. Nora hailed it 4 times over open comm. Nothing answered, not even the polite static of a channel left open with no one willing to speak into it. On the 5th hail, something shifted, not a voice, just the beacon's rhythm changing, 3 notes collapsing into 2, as if someone on the other end had reached over and altered the pattern by hand rather than say anything out loud. "That's not damage," Pip said quietly, watching the readout shift on his own display. "Damage doesn't change on purpose." Nora was already reaching for her chute. The airlock cycled slow, the way old ships' airlocks always did, groaning through a sequence built for a crew that had once trusted it completely. When the inner door opened, the corridor beyond was dim and cold and carried the particular smell of a ship that had been quietly dying for a while, recycled air gone thin and stale, the metallic tang of hull patches that didn't quite match the plating around them. Nora moved through it slow, light low, the way you learn to after enough salvage runs, not because there was usually danger waiting, but because there was usually something worse than danger. Grief. Evidence. The small, private wreckage of whatever had happened before you arrived. She passed an empty galley, cupboard stripped bare, and a cargo hold with restraint rings bolted to the floor in a pattern she didn't like the shape of and chose not to think about yet. She found the crew compartment at the end of the second corridor. 4 bunks. 3 stripped down to bare frames, the 4th holding a single figure, thin, grey-skinned, folded into the corner with a restraint band looped loose around one wrist, not locked, just looped, the way a habit stays even after the thing enforcing it has left the room. The figure's eyes opened when her light crossed his face. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for anything. He watched her the way something watches you when it has already decided, calmly and completely, that you cannot hurt it any worse than it has already been hurt. "I'm not here to collect anything," Nora said, because that seemed like the important thing to say first, even though she had no real idea yet what he might imagine she'd come to collect. "I heard your signal. I'm getting you out." His throat worked before he spoke, the words shaped carefully around a translator implant that lagged half a beat behind his mouth. "You changed course for a 6-day-old signal," he said. "On a dead relay. That is not a rational use of fuel." "No," Nora said, and found, to her own mild surprise, that she meant the next part completely. "It really isn't." She held out her hand. He looked at it for a long moment, the particular look of someone examining an object whose function he didn't fully trust, and then, slowly, he took it. Getting him back to the Sparrow took longer than it should have, mostly because he stopped twice, once at the threshold of his own quarters and once at the airlock itself, each time going very still in a way that Nora recognized without being able to name, the stillness of someone checking whether a door was actually going to open, or whether it had only ever looked like it would. Pip met them at the inner hatch with a blanket and a ration bar and no questions at all, which was, Nora thought, one of the more useful things about him. He simply looked at Kesh, said, "You're safe on this boat, whoever you are," and went back to prepping the return course, as if that settled the matter completely. For Kesh, watching him do it, it did not look settled at all. It looked like something he was still turning over, carefully, from every angle, the way you turn over a coin you suspect might not be real. His name, once the translator caught up properly, was Kesh. He was Orsai, a species Nora had traded with a handful of times over the years, always through intermediaries, never directly, because the Orsai rarely traveled independently anymore. She hadn't thought much about why until she was sitting across from him in the Sparrow's cramped galley, watching him eat a bowl of reconstituted stew like it was the first meal in longer than he could easily say that he had chosen for himself. "The others," Nora said carefully. "The empty bunks." "Reassigned," Kesh said. "Their obligations were transferred to a larger vessel 11 days before the drive failure. Mine was not transferred. My holder's account was under review." "Your holder." "The core combine," Kesh said, in the flat tone of someone stating a fact so basic it had never occurred to him it might need explaining. "I have belonged to their logistics division for 6 years, 4 months. The debt was for passage off my home station during a habitat failure, plus interest, plus the standard obligation multiplier for skilled labor." "Tell me about the habitat failure," Nora said, gently, because something in the way he'd said it told her there was more underneath the flat recitation than he was used to being asked about. Kesh was quiet for a moment. "A pressure seal failed on the agricultural ring," he said finally. 11 days before it was scheduled for inspection. My family worked that ring. There was one evacuation shuttle with capacity for 40, and 300 people trying to reach it. The Combine happened to have a transport in the system on an unrelated contract. They extended emergency passage to everyone who couldn't fit the shuttle, at standard emergency rates plus interest, which is generous, by their own account, because they were under no obligation to divert the transport at all. He said it without visible bitterness, the way you describe weather, a fact of the world rather than a wound in it. "My parents did not survive the initial failure. I was 19. I signed for passage because the alternative was staying, and I told myself, at the time, that 6 years was not so very long." "How long ago was that?" 6 years, 4 months, Kesh said. "It became 8 years, 11 months, after the interest recalculation 2 years in. I have not yet worked out how long it becomes after the most recent recalculation. I stopped checking. It felt, at some point, like checking was simply agreeing to keep losing." Nora didn't say anything for a while. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have sounded smaller than the thing he'd just told her. Nora set her own bowl down. "You're telling me you were left to die on a dead ship because your paperwork was under review." "I was not left to die," Kesh said, and there was something almost gentle in the correction, the tone of someone explaining a kindness she had simply misunderstood. "The Combine kept my life support account funded the entire time. That is why the beacon was quiet. Active distress calls incur a routing fee that was not authorized on my account. I could not activate one without approval that had not yet arrived. He paused, turning his spoon slowly in the bowl. You were the first vessel to answer regardless. Halyard Station came into view 6 hours later, a wheel of docking arms and cargo bays turning slow around a battered core, the kind of place that existed because the drift needed somewhere for salvage crews to sell what they found and buy what they'd need to go find more. Nora had run out of it for 11 years. She knew its rhythms the way she knew the Sparrow's own engine noise, the good days when the market decks were loud with trade, the slow days when half the berth sat dark, and the days a combined cutter sat parked in the outer ring like a held breath, which everyone on the market decks noticed and nobody commented on out loud. Today was the third kind of day. The message came through station traffic control before she'd even finished docking procedures. Not a warning exactly, more the kind of formally polite notice that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up precisely because of how polite it was. Salvage vessel Sparrow. Core combine records indicate an active obligation asset aboard. Please hold position for processing. Pip, reading the same message over her shoulder, went very quiet. Nora. I heard it. He's not cargo. I know that, Nora said, and looked back through the cockpit hatch toward the galley, where Kesh sat very still, listening to a conversation about himself with a patient, resigned attention of a man who'd learned long ago that these conversations happened around him, not with him. Nora keyed the comms station traffic control. This is Sparrow. I'm not holding position. I'm docking at Bay 9 like I've got a reservation for, because I do. She closed the channel before anyone could answer, and sat for a moment with her hand still on the console, feeling a small crack open in a life she'd worked very hard not to build with cracks in it. Down on the market deck an hour later, the crack was already visible to anyone paying attention. Nora walked the promenade with Kesh a careful half-step behind her, past stalls selling reclaimed hull parts and someone's home brewed liquor and a tinary trader arguing cheerfully with a customer over the price of salvaged optics, and she felt eyes follow them the way eyes follow anything that doesn't fit the pattern of an ordinary docking day. Elo Trask found them near the fuel exchange, a broad, weathered woman who ran an even older freighter than the Sparrow and had known Nora for a decade. She didn't ask questions. She just looked at Kesh, then at Nora, then said, "Lo, combined cutter's been parked in the outer ring since your transponder pinged the registry. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a good sign." I know, Nora said. You want to tell me what you drag home this time? Not yet, Nora said. Not until I understand it myself. Elo studied Kesh a moment longer, not unkindly, the way a person studies something they've seen the shape of before even if never quite this close. Orsai, she said. Combined bonded, by the way he's standing. I've hauled cargo alongside bonded crews for 20 years, Nora. You don't just borrow one of those. Whatever paperwork exists on him, the combine's going to want it on it. There isn't paperwork, Nora said. There's just me telling him he's not going anywhere he doesn't want to go. Elo laughed, short and without much humor in it. That's not going to mean a thing to them. It doesn't have to mean anything to them, Nora said. It only has to mean something to me. She left Elo at the fuel exchange and kept walking, Kesh a half-step behind, past a row of stalls where a tinary trader was loudly disputing the price of salvaged optics with a customer who seemed to be enjoying the argument more than the trader was, past a public terminal flickering with the day's trade prices, past a maintenance worker in combined coveralls who glanced at Kesh's collar band, then at Nora, then away again, quickly, the particular quickness of someone who has learned not to be. Caught looking at things that aren't his business. Halyard Station had been built 200 years ago by an independent consortium that no longer existed in any form Nora could have named, and in the 2 centuries since, the combine had absorbed its docking fees, its supply contracts, its trade licenses, one negotiated concession at a time, until owning the station outright had become almost unnecessary. It was easier, and cheaper, to simply own everything that ran through it. She had 6 hours before the combine's local office sent someone in person, which was, by Pip's calculation, exactly enough time to get badly informed instead of well informed, so Nora spent most of it doing the thing she was worst at and needed most, sitting still and asking questions. "Explain the ledger to me," she said, once Kesh had settled into the galley's second chair like he still wasn't fully convinced it was allowed. "All of it. Slow." Kesh turned the request over visibly before answering, the way he did most things, like a man checking a doorframe for traps before walking through it. Every being under combined jurisdiction receives a threat at birth, or at first contact if born outside it, he said. It tracks obligation. Favors given, favors owed, life debts, labor contracts, interest. It is read by any authorized station, any authorized employer. It cannot be removed without combined approval, which is rarely granted, because removal erases the record of what is owed, and the record of what is owed is the entire foundation of combined commerce. So if I save your life, Nora said, the ledger logs that I'm owed. If I were Orsai and you were also under combined jurisdiction, yes. The thread would register the life debt automatically, calculate its value against standard tables, and begin accruing interest until it was repaid through labor, currency, or transferred obligation. He paused. You are human. Your species does not carry threads. Why not? I do not know, Kesh said, and for the first time something like genuine curiosity crossed his face, the look of a man finding a gap in a map he'd always assumed was complete. The Combine's own literature calls it an anomaly. Humans conduct transactions of trust that are never recorded, never enforced by any external system, and yet, according to every audit reference I have seen, you honor them anyway. At a higher rate than ledger-bound obligations, which at least have consequences attached if broken. We just don't like owing people things we didn't agree to, Nora said. And when we do agree to something, we don't need a machine standing over us to make us keep it. Kesh was quiet for a long moment, turning his empty spoon over in his hands. That should not be possible, he said, not unkindly, more like a man double-checking arithmetic that kept coming out wrong. An obligation with no enforcement is not an obligation. It is a hope. Maybe, Nora said. Ask me again in a year. There is a term for it. In the old Orsai dialect my grandmother spoke, Kesh said, unprompted, after a silence that had stretched long enough Nora thought the conversation was over. It translates roughly as debt with no collector. It was considered, historically, a kind of foolishness. A debt with no collector was a debt nobody would ever actually pay, because why would they, once the threat of collection was gone? He turned the empty spoon over once more. I am beginning to think my grandmother's generation misunderstood the concept. I am beginning to think a debt with no collector might simply be the only kind that was ever real to begin with, and everything the ledger tracks is a shadow of that, built to be enforceable because nobody trusted the real thing to hold on its own. Nora didn't say anything to that. She let it sit in the room a while. The way she was learning he liked things to sit, and after a moment he seemed satisfied that she'd heard it properly, and went back to his stew. The station inspector arrived 4 hours early, which told Nora exactly how seriously the Combine was taking this. He was a compact, precise man named Ren Salt, technically Combine staff but the kind who'd processed so many routine cases he developed the tired courtesy of a man doing a job he didn't much enjoy and wasn't pretending otherwise. He scanned Kesh's thread with a handheld reader at the base of the docking ramp, read the results twice, and frowned in the specific way of a bureaucrat encountering a form that didn't want to close. Your obligation status shows active, Salt said to Kesh. Return to holder custody is standard procedure pending account resolution. Kesh's hand, Nora watched it happen in real time, began, almost involuntarily, to move toward the ramp rail. Not a decision. A pull. The kind of motion a body makes when a compulsion built into it for 6 years starts doing exactly what it was built to do. He's not going anywhere, Nora said, stepping forward. I gave him my word he's staying with this crew until his own account gets sorted properly, and I don't go back on my word. Salt looked at her with the particular blankness of a man checking his forms for a field that didn't exist. That is not a recognized transaction type. Doesn't need to be recognized, Nora said. It just needs to be true. Salt looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of paperwork that has started speaking to him directly, which was to say, with the mild, professional patience of someone who had absolutely no framework for what she just said and no intention of developing one on his own time. I'm not authorized to evaluate informal claims, he said, not unkindly. Only registered obligations. If you'd like to file a formal counter-bond, there's a process for that, though it typically requires combined co-signature and a minimum 6-week review period, during which the asset remains. He's not an asset, Nora said. He's cash. Salt blinked, the particular blink of a man being handed information his forms had no feel for. He glanced down at his reader, then back up at her, then, almost against his own better judgment, at Kesh himself, standing very still at the top of the ramp with his hand no longer moving. And Kesh's hand, halfway to the rail, caught in the pull of 6 years of compulsion, stopped. It stopped for 11 seconds. Nora counted, because counting was easier than thinking about what she'd just watched happen. Then Kesh's hand lowered, slow, and he stood very still, staring at his own fingers like they belonged to someone he was only now being introduced to. Salt made a note in his handheld, unbothered, filing the moment under whatever category his job required for things that didn't quite fit. A glitch, a delay, nothing worth escalating on a first pass. Account resolution paperwork will be filed, he said. This is not a permanent arrangement. And he left the way bureaucrats always left, unhurried, because unhurried was its own kind of message. We are not worried yet. Nora waited until his footsteps faded down the docking arm before letting out the breath she'd been holding. You felt that, she said to Kesh. Whatever that was. I felt the compulsion begin, Kesh said slowly. I have felt it begin many times. It has never stopped partway before. It either completes, or it is overridden by a higher priority instruction from an authorized holder. He looked at her, and something new moved across his face, careful and unsteady, like a man testing weight on a floor he wasn't sure would hold. You are not an authorized holder. No. Then there is no mechanism by which your statement should have interrupted mine. Maybe the mechanism isn't the point, Nora said. Maybe it's just that I meant it, and your threads never had to process something with nothing behind it but somebody meaning it. Kesh didn't answer that. He went quiet instead, the particular quiet of a man doing arithmetic he didn't yet have the tools for, and Nora let him have it, because some things you don't rush. It was Pip, 2 days later, elbow deep in the wreck's salvaged black box trying to recover flight data for a completeness bonus, who found the fragment. A ledger thread, old and damaged, pulled from a compartment in the derelict's crew quarters that hadn't shown up on any manifest. It didn't match any registry pattern currently in use. The encoding was older, clumsier, the kind of tech the Combine had phased out generations ago. This thing's got a name attached, Pip said, squinting at the readout in the cargo bay's dim worklight. Not a serial number. An actual name. And a note. Encrypted, but old encryption, the kind our decrypt library still remembers only because nobody's bothered updating the standard in decades. It took him another 6 hours to break it. When he did, he read it twice before calling Nora and Kesh both into the bay. This thread belonged to a worker whose promise the ledger could not price. The note read, in the stiff formal Combined standard of a much earlier era. Recommend suppression of anomaly pending further study. Case closed by order of regional oversight. Do not reopen. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The cargo bay's overhead light hummed faintly, the only sound in the room. That's not new, Nora said finally. Whatever's happening with you isn't new. Somebody found this before. A long time before. And somebody decided it was safer to close the case than to understand it, Kesh said quietly, still looking at the readout, at a name that wasn't his, on a thread that had sat quiet in a drawer for longer than the Combine's current legal department had existed. I would like to know what happened to them. So would I, Nora said. But I've got a feeling the Combine's about to give us a much more urgent reason to find out. In the days before that reason arrived, ordinary life aboard the Sparrow went on in the way ordinary life insists on doing even when something large and unresolved is sitting quietly in the room with everyone. Kesh learned to play a card game Pip had taught his younger sister years before he'd ever left home, and lost the first 6 hands so completely that Pip declared him structurally incapable of bluffing, which turned out, on the 7th hand, to be spectacularly untrue. Kesh won with a face so unreadable that Pip accused him, half serious, of having found the one card game in the galaxy the Combine hadn't managed to put a price on yet. You look like you were about to lose, Pip said, staring at his own cards in mild betrayal. You looked exactly like a man about to lose. I have had a great deal of practice appearing to accept an outcome I had no intention of accepting, Kesh said, and there was something so dry in the way he said it that Nora, watching from the galley doorway with a mug of coffee going cold in her hand, laughed out loud for the first time in longer than she could easily place, a real laugh, unplanned, the kind that surprised her a little on its way out. Kesh looked up at the sound, startled, and then, slowly, something in his own face loosened too, the beginning of an expression she hadn't seen on him before and wouldn't have known to call a smile if she hadn't watched it build itself, piece by careful piece, in real time. It was a small evening. Nothing about it solved anything. But Nora would think about it later, after everything else, as the moment the shape of things had quietly shifted, not because of the ledger fragment, not because of the compulsion that had stopped partway down a docking ramp, but because a man who had spent 6 years being told his choices didn't belong to him had just won a card game on purpose, and looked, for exactly as long as the win lasted, entirely pleased with himself. The urgent reason arrived 4 days later, and it did not come politely. Nora's fuel contract at Halyard Station Supply Dock, A standing arrangement she'd held for 6 years, never once missed a payment, was cancelled without warning. Her berth reservation, paid 3 months in advance, was suddenly under review. 2 buyers who'd handled her scrap hauls for years both sent apologetic, carefully worded messages explaining that current market conditions made continuing the arrangement inadvisable, in language so similar between the two of them that Nora didn't need Pip's confirmation to know it had come from the same source. "They're not sending sold again," Pip said, scrolling through the station's traffic log with the flat expression of a man reading bad news twice to make sure it was real. "They're sending someone with a title this time." The someone was a combined regional agent named Dale Vanth, and when he arrived at the Sparrow's docking bay, he came alone, unhurried, dressed in the kind of understated formal clothing that communicated authority through absence of decoration rather than presence of it. He was Vantic, tall and pale-jointed, with a voice pitched low enough that Nora found herself leaning in slightly just to catch it, which she suspected was exactly the intended effect. "Captain Cade," he said, "I want to be direct with you, because I think you're the kind of person who prefers that. You have an asset aboard your vessel that belongs, under binding contract, to the Corps Combine. I am not here to argue jurisdiction. I am here to explain what happens if this continues." "Go ahead," Nora said. "Your fuel access has already been suspended. Your berth reservations at 7 stations across the sector will follow within the week. Your buyers will find, gradually and without any formal instruction from us, that dealing with you has become inconvenient in ways they can't quite articulate. None of this will be traceable to a single decision. It will simply become true, the way weather becomes true. You have built a small, independent life here, Captain. I would hate to watch it become impossible to sustain." Nora looked at him for a long moment. "You're telling me you're going to starve me out for keeping a promise?" "I'm telling you the ledger doesn't recognize promises," Vance said. "It recognizes accounts. Yours is about to become very difficult to maintain. And if I hand him back, then everything returns to normal within the hour. This is, from where I'm standing, a very small problem with a very simple solution." Kesh, standing in the cargo bay entrance, had been listening the entire time and said nothing. Nora didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She could feel the shape of the moment anyway, the particular silence of someone waiting to find out whether he was about to become the price of somebody else's stability. "I gave my word," Nora said. "That's not an account. You can't collect on it, and you can't cancel it. So no. There's no simple solution here, Agent Vanth. There's just you, running out of polite ways to say the thing you actually mean, which is a threat." Vanth's expression didn't change, but something behind it did, a small recalculation, the look of a man updating a probability he'd been confident about a moment before. "That's unfortunate," he said. "For all of you." And he left, unhurried, the same way Salt had, except this time nobody in the bay mistook it for anything other than what it was. Pip watched him go from the top of the ramp, arms crossed, his usual running commentary conspicuously absent. "That's the kind of man who's never once had to raise his voice to get what he wants," he said finally. "That's worse than the kind who does." "I know," Nora said. "You're really not handing him back." "No." "Good," Pip said, and there was no argument left in it this time, only a kind of settled certainty that surprised her a little, coming from the man who'd complained about fuel budgets on the day they'd found Kesh in the first place. "Just checking we are all rowing the same direction before the water gets rough." Kesh, standing behind them both, said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, almost to himself, "I do not think I have ever watched 2 people decide to keep an obligation that costs them something, simply because they had already decided to keep it." He looked at Nora. "I am trying to understand what that decision is made of, if not fear of consequence." "Stubbornness, mostly," Nora said. "And the fact that going back on it would cost me something I care about more than fuel contracts." "What is that?" "Being able to look at myself in a mirror," Nora said, without flinching. The blacklist hit hard and fast. Within 3 days, Nora couldn't buy fuel a halyard, couldn't dock at 2 neighboring stations, couldn't find a single licensed buyer willing to take the scrap already sitting in her hold. It should have been the end of things, a small independent captain against an economic system with reach across the entire sector, and for about a week, it looked like it might be. Then the other captains started showing up. It began with Elo Trask, arriving at the docking bay with 200 litres of fuel she happened to have spare and absolutely refused payment for. "Don't thank me," she said, hauling the line across herself before Nora could argue. Thank whoever taught you to answer dead signals. I've been waiting years for somebody in this sector to make the Combine sweat, and I'd like to help, if it's all the same to you. Then a Drev trader named Jeska, who'd bought scrap from Nora for years, quietly rerouted a shipment through his own license. No ledger entry, no paperwork, just a nod and a murmured request that she remember the favor whenever she had one to spare. Then 3 more, then 5, a loose, informal network of independents who ran outside the Combine's cleanest channels precisely because they'd all, at some point in their own lives, learned the same lesson Nora had, that a system built entirely on enforceable debt left plenty of room for the kind of help that never needed enforcing at all. There was a Calaran repair tech named Dossa who fixed the Sparrow's failing coolant regulator for free on a slow shift, muttering the entire time that she was only doing it because she'd never liked the Combined supply office and this was cheaper than saying so out loud. There was a station bartender, a heavy-set man named Ferrin who ran the only cantina on the market deck that hadn't signed an exclusive supply contract with Combined distributors, who started quietly setting aside a corner table for Nora's crew every evening and refusing to itemize the tab. None of it was coordinated. Nobody called a meeting. It simply accumulated, the way trust accumulates among people who have all, independently, decided the same thing is worth protecting, and Nora found herself keeping a mental list of names she intended to repay properly, someday, once she understood what properly was even going to mean. This isn't sustainable long-term, Pip said one evening, cataloguing the growing pile of favors in a battered notebook because none of them would go on any official record. But it buys us time. It's not supposed to be long-term, Nora said. It's supposed to hold until we figure out what we are actually looking at. What they were looking at, it turned out, was bigger than a single blacklist. Kesh, working late in the cargo bay with a recovered ledger fragment and a translation table Pip had helped him build, found 3 more suppressed anomaly cases buried in the old encoding. Different names, different eras, always the same pattern. A worker whose promise-based obligation the thread couldn't price. A recommendation to suppress. A closed case, never reopened. 4 incidents, Kesh said, laying the pattern out for Nora in the galley one night, his voice carrying a controlled tension she hadn't heard from him before. 4 times in Combined history that a bonded worker encountered someone who kept a promise the ledger could not track, and 4 times the case was closed rather than studded. I do not think that is caution, Captain. I think it is fear. Fear of what? One glitch. Fear of what happens if the glitch is not contained, Kesh said. If enough bonded workers learn that a promise can hold weight the ledger cannot see, the ledger stops being the only thing worth trusting. And an economy built on enforceable debt cannot survive very many people deciding trust doesn't require enforcement. Nora sat with that for a long moment, the galley quiet around them, Pip's off-key humming drifting faintly from the engine room down the corridor. Then it's not really about you, she said slowly. It never was. It's about what you'd tell the others if you got the chance. Kesh looked at her, and for the first time since she'd pulled him off that dying ship, there was something in his face that wasn't caution or careful arithmetic. It looked, unmistakably, like resolve. Yes, he said. I believe it is. What none of them knew, not then, was that Vanth had spent those 2 days arguing with his own regional oversight about exactly this decision. The blacklist had been his idea, and it had failed, not because Nora Cade had run out of resources, but because an entire informal economy of favors had simply absorbed the pressure and kept functioning, which was, according to every model his office used to predict outcomes like this, not supposed to be possible. His superiors wanted the matter closed quietly. Vanth, to his own quiet frustration, had become convinced that quiet was no longer an option, and that the only way to close it now was to make it loud enough that the loudness itself did the work, a public reclamation, visible, procedurally unimpeachable, designed to remind every bonded worker within range exactly how enforceable the ledger still was. It was, he told himself, walking toward the Sparrow's berth with 4 officers behind him, simply good account management. He did not examine, closely, why the thought sat as uneasily in him as it did. 2 days later, Vanth came back, and this time he didn't bring polite warnings. He brought a station enforcement order and 4 armed combined security officers, and he came to take Kesh by force. They cornered the Sparrow at her own berth, security officers stationed at both ends of the docking arm, Vanth standing at the base of the ramp with the enforcement order displayed on a handheld like a shield he was confident nobody would try to argue with. This is no longer a commercial dispute, Vanth said. Regional oversight has classified your assets' continued absence a contract violation with sector-wide implications. I have authorization to reclaim him, by force if necessary. I'd prefer it wasn't necessary, Captain. I don't think you'd prefer it either. Nora stood at the top of the ramp, Pip a half-step behind her, Elo Trask and 2 other independents who'd heard the traffic chatter arriving fast enough to form a loose, worried line at the docking arm's edge. It wasn't a fight anyone could win, and everybody standing there knew it. The market deck beyond had gone unusually quiet, the way a crowd goes quiet when it senses something is about to happen and isn't sure yet whether to watch or look away. A few dozen people had gathered at a careful distance along the promenade railing above, station workers on break, traders who'd left their stalls untended, the particular crowd that forms whenever the ordinary rhythm of a place breaks and everyone wants to see, without quite admitting it, how it breaks. Captain Cade, Vance said again, when she didn't answer immediately, I'd remind you that obstruction of a combined enforcement order carries its own penalties. Ones that extend to everyone standing behind you. I heard you the first time, Nora said. I'm still deciding whether I care. You should care, Vance said. These 4 officers didn't come here to negotiate a second time. Neither did I, Nora said, and didn't move. It was Kesh who stepped forward. Wait, he said, and something in his voice, steady, deliberate, entirely his own, made even Vance pause. I would like to go with you. Nora turned. Kesh. Not because I owe you nothing, he said quietly, not looking away from her. Because I owe you everything, and I am not willing to let that debt cost you your ship, your crew, your life here. That is not the kind of obligation your species carries. I understand that now. But it is the kind mine does, and I would rather carry it than watch you lose everything protecting me. For a moment, nobody moved. Vanth's expression shifted towards something almost like satisfaction, the look of a man watching a difficult account finally balance itself the way it was always supposed to. That's not your choice to make, Nora said, low, urgent. Not like this. Not out of fear for us. It is exactly my choice, Kesh said. That is the part you taught me, Captain. That a choice made freely is worth more than one made under compulsion, even when it costs something. He turned toward Vanth, and his voice, when he spoke again, carried out across the docking arm loud enough for every officer standing there to hear it clearly. I'll return. But I want it recorded, publicly, on open station channel, that I am choosing this. Not compelled. Chosen. I want every bonded worker within range of this broadcast to hear a combined agent confirm, on the record, that a choice like that is even possible. Vanth's satisfaction flickered, just slightly, into something more careful. He hadn't expected the request, and Nora watched him run the calculation, deny it and look like he feared what a simple confirmation might cost him, or grant it and assume nobody bonded to a ledger would know what to do with the idea of a free choice anyway. Fine, Vance said, after a pause a half-second too long. Open channel. Say what you like. Behind Nora, Elo Trask let out a breath she'd clearly been holding since the officers first arrived. He doesn't know what he just agreed to, she murmured, low enough that only Nora and Pip caught it. He thinks a speech is just noise, as long as the outcome stays the same. Pip, beside her, didn't say anything at all, just watched Kesh's back as he stood at the ramp's edge, and for once had absolutely nothing to add. It was, Nora would think later, the single worst business decision Dale Vanth ever made. Chapter 8. Kesh stepped to the edge of the docking arm, station cameras, and open comm channels carrying his voice out across every deck of Halyard Station, into every bay and berth and crew quarters where bonded workers thread-hummed quietly at the base of their skull, tracking obligations they had never once been told they were allowed to question. My name is Kesh, he said. 6 years ago I was rescued by a woman who owed me nothing and asked for nothing in return. I did not understand what that meant, because everything I had ever been taught said an obligation without enforcement was not real. I want to tell you what I have learned instead. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The whole station was listening. A promise made freely does not need a ledger to make it true. It is true because someone chose it, and keeps choosing it. Every day they don't take it back. Your thread was built to make you believe that kind of choice doesn't exist, because if it existed, if enough of us believed in it, the entire structure built on top of your debt would have nothing left to stand on. Somewhere in the station's lower decks, a bonded dock worker who had spent 9 years paying down a debt inherited from a parent she'd never met stopped what she was doing and listened. Somewhere in the cargo processing bay, 3 Orsai Laboris on a 12-year contract exchanged a look none of them would have dared exchange an hour earlier. In a maintenance corridor 2 decks down, A young Tinari technician who had never once questioned the thread humming quietly at the base of his skull found himself replaying Kesh's words twice, then a third time, then quietly asking a coworker, for the first time in his working life, whether either of them had ever actually read the terms of the contract they'd both been born into. In the cantina Ferrin ran, half a dozen off-shift workers sat in silence around a table that had gone still the moment the broadcast started, and stayed still long after it ended, nobody quite ready to be the first to say what they were all thinking. It didn't happen everywhere, all at once, the way a switch flips. It happened the way water finds a crack, slow, then sudden, then unstoppable. I am choosing to go with Agent Vanth, Kesh said. Because I made a promise, and I intend to keep it, the way I was taught by someone who keeps hers. But I want every one of you listening to understand, that choice was mine. Nobody's thread made it for me. And if it was mine to make, it can be yours too. He turned and walked down the ramp toward Vanth without looking back. What happened over the following hours was not, according to the Combine's own internal reports released much later, a coordinated uprising. It was smaller than that, and stranger, a slow, scattered wave of bonded workers across Halyard Station beginning, independently, to test the boundaries of obligations they'd never questioned before. A cargo handler quietly extending unpaid help to a stranded crew and refusing the ledger credit. A debt-bonded pilot declining a transferred contract on the grounds that she'd rather owe it freely to someone she trusted than have it assigned by an algorithm that had never asked her opinion. None of it broke any law. All of it broke a pattern the Combine's entire local economy had been built to assume would never break. Vanth took Kesh into custody that evening, exactly as the order required. He held him for 11 days, during which, station records later confirmed, for separate anomaly reports crossed his desk, all describing the same pattern the old suppressed case files had described generations before, bonded workers whose obligations the ledger suddenly, inexplicably, could not fully account for. Nora didn't see Kesh during those 11 days, but she heard about them, secondhand, through Elo and through a Combined Records clerk who owed Elo a favor of his own and was willing, quietly, to describe the shape of what was happening inside the regional office without technically telling anyone anything. Vanth, apparently, had spent most of the first week trying to explain the broadcast to his own superiors as an isolated incident, a single anomaly, contained and manageable. By the second week, that explanation had stopped holding, and the tone of the internal memos the clerk described, careful, defensive, increasingly focused on narrative containment rather than asset recovery, told Nora everything she needed to know about how badly the arithmetic had gotten away from him. She tried, on the third day, to request a visitation window through the regional office's public terminal, and was informed, politely, by an automated system with no human or Vantic voice behind it at all, that visitation for assets under active account review was not a recognized category of request. She tried again on the 6th day, in person, and was told by a different clerk, not unkindly, that Agent Vanth was unavailable and that the matter was, as far as the front desk was concerned, closed. She stood in the regional office's public lobby for a long moment after that, looking at the calm, orderly rows of chairs bolted to the floor and the pleasant ambient chime that played every time someone's number was called, and thought about how much effort had clearly gone into making a system this thorough feel this unremarkable, and left without arguing further, because arguing further wasn't going to open a door built specifically not to open. She spent those 11 days the way she spent most difficult stretches, working. She and Pip ran 2 short salvage jobs through favors from Yeska's contacts, keeping just enough currency moving to cover docking fees, and in the evening she sat in the galley with the old ledger fragment Kesh had left behind and read the 4 suppressed case files over and over, looking for a pattern she could use rather than simply admire. On the 10th night, she found it, a line in the earliest case, dated so long ago the calendar system it used had been retired twice since, noting that the anomaly had first been detected not in an individual thread, but in a shared one, 2 bonded workers whose accounts had briefly synchronized during a joint labor contract. The ledger, it turned out, had never been built to process an unlinked promise moving from one bonded mind to another. It had only ever been tested against a promise held by one person, alone. Nobody, in 4 separate generations, had ever tried to see what happened if it spread. On the 12th day, Nora Cade walked into the regional Combine office without an appointment and sat down across from Dale Vanth, who looked considerably less composed than he had on the docking ramp. "I'm not here to negotiate," Nora said. "I'm here to tell you Kesh's account is closed. I'm settling his debt myself, in full, at whatever the ledger says it's worth, and then I'm walking out of here with him. And I want it recorded, on the same open channel you used before, that a human paid an Orsai life debt in full, publicly, with no argument." Vanth looked at her for a long moment. Then, quietly, almost to himself, "It won't stop what's already started. You understand that?" "I'm counting on it," Nora said. "I did everything the ledger required," Vanth said, and there was something unfamiliar in his voice now, something that might, in a different man, have been the beginning of doubt. The blacklist, the enforcement order, the custody. Every step was procedurally correct, and none of it worked the way it was supposed to. "I would like to understand why, Captain, if you're willing to tell me." Nora considered him for a moment, not the agent who'd threatened her fuel contracts, not the man who'd stood at the base of a ramp with an enforcement order like a shield, just a person, tired, doing arithmetic that had stopped balancing. "Because you built a system that only knows how to count things people are forced to give," she said. "You never built anything to measure what people hand over on purpose. So when it started happening, you didn't have a column for it. That's not a flaw in cash. That's a flaw in the ledger. It always was." Vanth didn't answer that. He simply processed the transaction, in silence, and let her go. The debt was settled in 11 minutes, once Vanth stopped stalling and let the transaction process. Kesh walked out of the Combine's regional office beside Nora with his thread still active. The Combine had refused, even now, to remove it, on the grounds that removal required an approval process that would take, they claimed, several more months. But for the first time in 6 years, for months, and however many days, the account attached to it read, simply, satisfied. They didn't speak much on the walk back to the Sparrow. The market deck was busy around them, ordinary and loud, and Nora found herself watching it differently than she had a week before, wondering how many of the people moving past carried threads that had never once been tested the way Kesh's had. "Can I ask you something?" Kesh said, once they were back aboard, sitting across from each other in the galley with 2 bowls of stew neither of them had touched yet. "Go ahead." "Why did you answer the signal? That first day. You said it wasn't rational." Nora considered the question longer than she'd expected to. "My mother used to say that the only promises worth making are the ones you'd keep even if nobody was watching," she said finally. "I think some part of me wanted to know if that was still true out here, this far from anywhere anybody was watching. Seemed like a good place to test it." "And was it true?" "I don't know yet," Nora said. "But I know I'd answer that signal again tomorrow, even knowing everything it cost us this time. So I think that's as close to an answer as I've got." Kesh nodded slowly, and for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled, a small, careful thing, like a man trying an expression he hadn't been sure his face still remembered how to make. "I would like to learn to make a promise like that," he said. "One that doesn't need a thread to keep it honest." "You already made one," Nora said. "On that docking ramp, in front of the whole station. Nobody's thread told you to do that." "No," Kesh agreed. "It didn't." He was quiet for a while after that, turning his spoon over in the stew he still hadn't eaten, and when he spoke again his voice had dropped into something quieter, more careful, the tone of a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying without mentioning it. "There is a thing I have not told you," he said. "The thread does not simply disappear when its account reaches 0. It remains. It listens. I do not know, yet, whether settling my debt in front of an open channel changed anything permanent, or whether it only bought me time until the Combine finds a new account to open against me." "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," Nora said. "Same as we dealt with the last thing." "You say that very easily." "I've had more practice than you at not knowing how something ends," Nora said. 11 years of answering signals I couldn't guarantee would go anywhere good. You get used to it. Not comfortable. Used to it." She pushed her own bowl toward him, still mostly full. "Eat. You've had a long 12 days. Kesh looked at the bowl, then at her, and something in his shoulders loosened, just slightly, the particular loosening of a man who has just been told, in the smallest possible way, that he is allowed to simply be tired for a while instead of vigilant. He picked up the spoon. 6 months later, Halyard Station looked, on the surface, almost exactly the way it always had. The same wheel of docking arms, the same slow-turning core, the same mix of independent captains and licensed traders working the same tired routines. But underneath, something had shifted in a way the Combine's own quarterly reports, leaked eventually onto the independent trade channels, described with visible discomfort as elevated anomaly frequency across bonded labor accounts, sector-wide. Nobody in the reports used the word Nora would have used. Nobody called it hope. But the numbers told the story anyway, in the careful, bloodless language institutions use when they don't yet know how to describe the thing that's actually happening to them. The market deck itself had changed in small, hard-to-name ways. Farron's cantina had expanded into the empty stall beside it, busier now than it had ever been, mostly with bonded workers on break who'd started treating the corner table Nora's crew used as an unofficial gathering point, a place to trade quiet information about which contracts were worth questioning and which weren't. Ren Salt, of all people, had taken to eating lunch there twice a week, technically off-duty, technically not discussing combined business, though Nora had noticed he always seemed to arrive with a great deal of information he was very carefully not sharing on purpose. Kesh had stayed with the Sparrow's crew. He never formally left the combined system. His thread was still active, still logging the small ordinary transactions of daily life, but somewhere in the last 6 months, without any of them quite marking the moment it happened, he'd stopped being crew Nora had rescued and started being crew, full stop, the kind whose bunk had his own things in it now, a few small trinkets bought with his own wages, and whose opinion on cargo routes got listened to instead of just recorded. It was Pip who found the next distress call, 6 days into a routine run through a stretch of the drift none of them had worked before, 3 faint notes, repeating, on a frequency nobody used anymore. "That's not a paying signal," Pip said, out of old habit, already reaching for the nav controls before Nora had said a word. "I know," Nora said. "Just checking you still know it," Pip said, and grinned, and set the course. Kesh, standing at the cockpit hatch, watched the wreck grow larger on the display. Another ship, another silence, another someone who might or might not still be breathing inside it, waiting to find out whether the universe still ran entirely on ledgers, or whether, sometimes, somebody came anyway, for reasons a thread could never fully price. "Do you think there's someone alive over there?" he asked. "I don't know," Nora said, the way she always said it, the way that had once sounded to him like uncertainty and now sounded like something closer to faith. "But I know what I'm going to do about it either way." Behind them both, unnoticed for the moment, Pip had already begun logging the run the way he logged every run now, not just fuel burn and cargo estimates, but a second column he'd started keeping without being asked, one Nora had found by accident 3 months earlier and never mentioned finding. It was a short list, growing slowly, of names: the derelict cargo hauler outside Braze Reach, the 2-person survey team stranded past the Outer Marker Boys, a station kid's runaway shuttle nobody official had bothered chasing down. None of it paid. All of it, according to Pip's notes, had gone about as well as anybody could reasonably ask. Kesh had asked him once why he kept the list at all, since none of it went on any ledger anyone would ever check. Pip had shrugged, in the particular way he had of making something sound smaller than it was. "Somebody should remember," he'd said. "Doesn't have to be a thread that does the remembering. Can just be a person, with a notebook, who cares enough to bother." Kesh had thought about that answer for a long time afterward, turning it over the way he turned over most things, carefully, from every angle, checking for a mechanism, an enforcement clause, some hidden structure that made the remembering obligatory. He hadn't found one. He'd stopped looking for one, somewhere in the last 6 months, and started simply trusting that it would be there anyway, the next time it mattered, the same way it always had been. She opened the channel, hailed the wreck, and waited, unhurried, to see who answered.